It is Friday again, and that means we are about to kick off another weekend of Legends of Runeterra tournament action. My name is Boulevard. I will be your host for this, as I always have been. Who else would do it? We're going to go over the tournament tier list. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to be casting this weekend, and yeah, we're going to have a pretty good time. This one's going to be a little bit light. I'm not going to go super in-depth on lineups. I'm mostly going to go over the tier list, just because there aren't any quote-unquote major tournaments this weekend. The online league series, of course, will be happening, and of course EU Masters is going to be happening as well, so even if there were a major tournament, a lot of the big players would be missing. But I'm not really going to go over the EU Masters format, because I do like to focus more on tournaments that you will be playing in and trying to help you find success. So the EU Masters players have their stuff sort of figured out, so I'm here to help you instead. And we're going to go for the region-locked 3-deck format. That is what the online league series will be playing in, and that seems like your best bet if you're looking for a tournament this weekend. So there have been quite a few overhauls to the tier list since the last time that I had it out. Scouts, with the addition of Blinding Assault, have really started to carve a niche out for themselves in the meta, and are probably the best aggro deck at the moment. We're starting to see Shen Fiora try to come out to counter the Scouts, and honestly, it's not actually working out as well as you would kind of hope it to. Scouts have really been able to take a defensive line with multiple copies of Sharp Sight and Ranger's Resolve. It's just really hard to kill Misfortunes nowadays, and if Misfortune does stick, we're seeing her level up constantly as early as turn 5. It's kind of weird, because the deck does now feel a little bit more all in on that Misfortune plan, but hey, that's sometimes the way that decks sort of play themselves out in Legends of Runeterra. The champion mechanic is really cool, so having your deck be all in on a champion, even if it is an aggro deck, it does play a little bit better without the Misfortune than something like Discard aggro would play without the Jinx, so it's not hyper all in, but with things like Blinding Assault, they really are hedging their bets more towards drawing that Misfortune. Then I have War Mothers and Field of Rush. I have both of them still up here. These are both going to be Freljord Shadow Isle versions. I wanted to do like a whole video on the differences between War Mothers and Field of Rush, but honestly, it didn't seem like something that was super interesting when I could just talk about it here. Essentially, the difference is War Mothers is going for a longer game. Field of Rush is going to end things a little bit more immediately, and what that means is that in deck building considerations specifically, you don't have to build your deck around Field of Rush like you do with War Mothers. So the main difference that we're actually seeing between these two decks is that War Mothers is running things like Avarosan Hearthguard and Alpha Wildclaw, and Field of Rush is running things like Avarosan Sentry, Kindly Tavern Keeper, maybe even Babbling Beerg at this point, but probably not, because it would pull a champion that might then get taken out of your hand for Field of Rush. So that's mainly the difference, is the Avarosan Sentry Tavern Keeper versus the Wildclaw Hearthguard. So it's really just a consideration on the kind of playstyle that you want to go for. With something like Spooky Karma back in the meta, that's why I still have War Mothers in tier 1, while Field of Rush does generally have a better chance against the field. I think War Mothers does have a little bit of a better shot into some of the other control decks in the format, of which we are starting to see more and more pop up. We're getting a little bit more Heimerdinger in here, getting a little bit more Spooky Karma, just stuff like that. Anything, Deep is even popping up a little bit more, and I think that those are decks where War Mothers probably still has a little bit of a better matchup. It's pretty close, if you want to run Field of Rush, you're not going to have a bad time into these things per se, but you do have to be careful with how you play your Tryndamirs in a deck like that. But maybe that's a matchup breakdown that I'll get to do in the future, because it has been a while since I did one of those, but that's not the point of the video. Then moving on, Discard Aggro is still one of the better decks of the format. The Make It Rain nerf is being felt across the board. This is a deck that is, sort of getting its day in the sun thanks to that. So many 1-health units in this deck, but as I had mentioned, a lot more control decks popping up into the format, and that means a lot more Withering Whales running around. But we are in sort of this meta where you feel like you have to take things one step further, where we're seeing a lot of aggro decks pop up, like Scouts and Discard and Pirates, and it's like, okay, so I want to run Withering Whale, but then you run into a control mirror, and it's like, wow, these Withering Whales, these Avalanches, they're so totally useless. I need to cut down on those. And it's a matter of, how much do you want to take that one step further? Generally, for the region-locked formats, I feel like aggro is going to be a lot more prevalent, especially last week. Going into this week, it might be a little bit different, but I do think that Scouts is going to be one of the more popular decks. So what you can do is you can just craft an anti-aggro lineup, and that's what a lot of people are trying to do, because in DOR 17, it was a little bit of a different format, but for the most part, we saw more aggro lineups than Field of Rush topping, because it was just a lot more aggro in the format. There were so many people that were trying to beat the Field of Rush decks, and they were just getting taken out by aggro. So when you ask yourself, on this next level thinking of, okay, we cut the whales to have a better control matchup, but now we lose to aggro, so we put them back in, then we lose to control. It looks like for the most part, people have stopped that step ladder thinking at the aggro process. So aggro, extremely prevalent in the region locked format, in all formats of Legends of Runeterra at the moment. So if you're thinking, do I need to tech for aggro or do I need to tech for the control mirror? You need to tech for aggro. That's just kind of the spot that the wider spread of meta has found itself in for the time being. Starspring, I still think, is, a very popular deck, very powerful. Pale Cascade and Guiding Touch doing a lot of work in a deck like this. We're starting to see a split in the lists, and I only have one sample list here, and that's sort of your standard Broadback Protector, Stall Out, Starspring Victory deck, but we've seen a couple of the lists start to lean more on Star Shepherd, and even go as far as to put things like Zenith Blade into the main deck to go for those games where your opponent is just kind of going, okay, well, I'm not going to attack into your units, and then how are you going to win with Starspring? Just giving you that alternate win condition. Unfortunately, I don't have a sample deck list for it, but I'm sure if you scour the internet or ask any of the pro players that you see playing Starspring, they can go ahead and give you a list, or you could just craft up your own. It's just going to be a little bit more unit focused. The Star Shepherds do need to be in there. That is sort of your main win condition. Spooky Karma, obviously, if we are going into a control meta, you think, what's the best Ionia control deck to be able to stop the Field of Rush, but also something that a lot of people don't necessarily think about is if your opponent denies Field of Rush, they have an 8 mana swing. If they're not playing a deck that can do anything with that 8 mana swing, it doesn't really matter. Like Lee Sin, if they already have Lee on the field, they're really not doing a whole lot with that excess mana, since they need to be playing the spells the turn that they're actually going in with the Lee Sin, because it's a lot of temporary buffs, things like that. Spooky Karma, if they deny your Lee Sin deny your Field of Rush and then get down a Karma, they're in a commanding position, and overall this is just one of the better control decks to take it to the late game versus the other control decks, while still having a good spot against aggro decks. And this is probably one of the decks that has been talked about the most. If you watched my review for the KDA cards that talked about how Go Get It and Go Hard felt like they could very easily fit into Spooky Karma, some people are still playing Go Get It. That's mostly gone to the wayside, but Go Hard is definitely on full display in a deck like this. So if you're looking for something to play, like, I could make a competitive list for every KDA card, which is not something that I feel like I can do for a lot of new sets, and it wouldn't feel forced at all. And Spooky Karma is definitely the premier tier 1 Go Hard deck. And then Go Get It Wraiths is sort of the premier Go Get It deck, in my opinion, where it's still Ionia Shadow Isle, but you get to play Mist Wraiths, and Go Get Iting a Wraith Caller is one of the most aggressive plays I've ever seen, and just gives you absolutely an insane amount of power on board. So this is like a very explosive, very consistent, reminiscent of the old Fearsome decks, and honestly, it's one of the more consistent aggro decks that I've ever played, and tier 1 might be a little bit high for it, but I have a lot of confidence in this deck going forward. I just don't know how much people are actually going to bring it to region lock tournaments, because Ionia Shadow Isle can be a rough consideration, especially if you're already not playing Spooky Karma. But I do think this has a lot of space in aggro lineups where you're going for scouts, and then you get to play something like this. And Shadow Isle has kind of always been a question mark for the aggro lineups. Do you want to go Endure? Do you want to go Nightfall? Do you want to go Get It? But because Freljord, Ionia, and Targon are generally regions that are going to be left out of the aggro lineup, I think that Go Get It Wraiths is currently my pick for the strongest Shadow Isle aggro deck. And then down in tier 2, we've got the things that kind of fill out lineups. We've got Ramp Soul. This is starting to play Field of Rush, but it's not totally there yet. I think the Ramp Soul builds are still being workshopped, but I do think the deck has a lot of potential. Frostbite midrange looks the same as it ever did. Shen Fiora, same thing. Deep, always going to be meta dependent. People are still figuring out the list for this one. Nightfall just kind of falling to the wayside as there's not as much Lee Sin in the format. Nightfall is, what from my understanding, sort of the anti-aggro deck, and it just doesn't do as well into the aggro decks that we're seeing as it has in the past. So it's kind of fallen down a little bit, and also just doesn't do phenomenally against the amount of Withering Wails that we're seeing out of control decks in the format. So Nightfall's in a bit of an awkward spot, but I still think the raw power of the deck is there. Karma Lux, a deck that I've talked about a lot, just a great anti-aggro tool. Probably doesn't do as well into things like Field of Rush or War Mothers as you would want it to, but I do think you can very specifically counter build Karma Lux for some of the tier 1 decks. Put in multiple copies of Detain, something along those lines, because if your opponent does Field of Rush and you have the same amount of mana because they haven't ramped as hard necessarily or something along those lines, then when they go Field of Rush, if you have 13 mana, that's Detain and Unyielding Spirit mana, so you could really start to take control of the game from that point, and just lock up a bunch of Detains, because there's no way for a Field of Rush deck to actually deal with an Unyielding Spirited unit. especially one like Karma or Lux, because generally the answer to Unyielding Spirit was to Frostbite it, but these are sort of backline champions that I don't really care about. TF Swain, has fallen down. We're seeing it shift more towards an aggressive state more so. We're seeing Krusty Codger more often. Salty Simon actually picked up a win in DR17 running both Krusty Codger and Jagged Butcher, so just really playing the TF Swain like an aggro deck with that Swain Leviathan top end. So we'll kind of have to track the progression of this deck, but I think that people are still figuring out the build for it. Between the Petty Officer nerf that we never really landed on, do we play this card, do we not play this card? Now Make It Rain coming out, it's just, the raw power is not quite what it used to be. Of course, Targon Lee Sin, still a staple. Pirate aggro finally falling out of tier 1. Scouts is just the better Bilgewater aggro deck for the time being. And then with your Noxus, you can pair that into discard aggro or something. I think that like Scouts discard go get it rates, it probably won't be the most popular aggro lineup, but I think it's the best aggro lineup for a regional lock tournament right now. Leona Luxsoul, I put all 3 champions in here because we are seeing all 3 of them sort of cycled amongst themselves. We're seeing Leona Lux, we're seeing Lux Asol, we're seeing Leona Asol. So I just kind of categorize them all together. It's not often that we're seeing all 3 in the same deck, but the decks all play very similarly, even if it's something like Mountain Scryer versus no Mountain Scryer. The power level of the deck is there, the consistency is not, and I'm not sure that it can even take it to the late game against things like Field of Rush. It's not a better Targon deck than Ramp Soul, but if you wanted to commit your Freljord over here, and then you still wanted an Aurelion Soul deck, I think that it does have its space. And much like Karma Lux, the tools that I had called out for beating Field of Rush were specifically Demacia. Of course, you have Deny, but you do still get things like Detain, and I think that you could build a Leona Lux Soul deck to counterpick the Field of Rush decks. So if that is the kind of lineup that you're trying to craft for yourself, I think you've actually got a pretty good spot there. Endore's been picking up lately. Spider Aggro's been picking up lately. I don't think these are necessarily the best aggro decks, but they are flavorful choices that you can use to fill out a different lineup. It would feel wild to me, though, to play Endore in a meta like this, in a 3-deck region-locked format specifically, where, you have access to things like Field of Rush, because I don't think Endore's counter picks are really quite there right now. It's a little hard to say. It's much more of a combo-focused aggro deck, sort of like Nightfall at the moment, but overall, I'm just not a big fan of Endore's spot in the meta, especially because Frostbite is still being run en masse to deal with Field of Rush, and, we're seeing a lot of harsh winds come out where we haven't before, so I think it's just Endore's in a bit of a rough spot, unfortunately, for the meta. In 2-deck, it's a little bit different, but for 3-deck region-locked, I think it's a little risky. And then Targon Vimer has been starting to pick up popularity. The builds are becoming a lot more streamlined. You can check out the sample list. The power level of the deck is there. It's always kind of hard to say. Does it out late game something like Field of Rush? It has potential to, but as always, it's going to depend on, did you get your Heimer down? Did it stick? Because you're not running Ionia anymore. You don't have that deny protection. Some people aren't even running Bastion. They just run no protection for the Heimer. They just raw dog it, say, you know what? You're not running removal for my Heimer in a capacity like that. But honestly, I am worried for its potential against some of the other control decks in the format. I think it's a little bit too easy for something like Spooky Karma to deal with, but we'll see. Once again, Withering Wail is back. Avalanche is back. Getting these big boards out, especially when you're not running something like Deny, is a challenge. But Vi does a lot of work right now, especially just running into Field of Rushed units. So, kind of track that one. I think that it's important to have it on the tier list because it is picking up in popularity, but overall, I think that low tier 2 is probably where I would put it. But as I've always mentioned in these videos, all of these lists can top a tournament or even win a tournament, and that's why they're on here. It's just more so a comparative power level from tier 2 to tier 1, and yeah, you can actually run into a bunch of matchups where you can win a tournament with Targon Vimer. That's very realistic. And then down in tier 3, we've got some relics of the past that are still starting to pop up. I don't have, unfortunately, sample deck lists for all of them. Zombie Ash has really fallen to the wayside as it just doesn't deal with the immediate power that Field of Rush offers. It can grind out War Mothers, but the Field of Rush decks definitely put a lot more pressure on the Zombie Ash than it's been able to deal with, and this was always a very specific counter meta pick. So we just have kind of see it fall to the wayside. It'll pop back up eventually, but I mean, you can still put it in a lineup, and if you run into the matchups that it's good against, yeah, you're probably going to win the tournament, and a lot of people just like the deck, so it does still have its place in the format, and I am a little bit worried to run a Harrowing deck in a format where we do have so much Ionia running around between, Spooky Karma and Lee Sin and some of these other decks that we're seeing come out to target the Field of Rush. I just think that Harrowing is a casualty of the format where it's just a little unfortunate. Dragons, of course, still really haven't found a place, haven't found a build. Nab, really just not performing super well against the late game pressure that everything else does. Nab has always been very tempo focused and doesn't deal with ramp particularly well. And when you're in a format where, potentially your Riptide Rex just doesn't kill anything on the board, that's a rough spot to be in. And then Karma Ezreal has been coming back as a very specific counter pick. I'm not super sold on it. It's really not performing like it used to, obviously, but in the upcoming patch, I think that they had singled out Ezreal as one of the cards that they felt like they missed the mark with on the nerf, so I don't think they're going to necessarily revert it, but they are going to look to change it in some way. And because Piltover and Zaun is so underused, I think that Karma Ezreal is a great way to round out a lineup, especially if you're looking for an Ionia deck, just because you want Deny in your lineup, but you couldn't really commit your Shadow Isle to it. Feel the Rush, Karma Ezreal, and then some kind of Demacia deck, maybe Targon Lux or something, could be a lineup that you want to use to pick on something like Feel the Rush. But as I had mentioned, I'm not really going to get into lineups too much this week. As you can see, I added a lot of decks to the tier list. The tournaments this weekend are kind of low stakes, but just kind of be aware of what people are running. As I had mentioned, I think that Scouts, Discard, Go Get It is the best aggro lineup, but not necessarily the most popular. As far as actual most popular lineup, I think it's probably going to be, Feel the Rush, TF Swain, and Lee Sin isn't necessarily off the table. People just still kind of defaulting onto a lineup like that, but honestly, because the format is so open, I'm not confident in making any call on a most popular lineup. It's more so what are going to be the most popular decks, and I think that's definitely going to be Scouts and Feel the Rush. You could even put those both in the same lineup. Unfortunately, that's kind of like the most solid analysis that I can give you, and as I had mentioned, there's going to be a really big patch next week, so in the meantime, I'm just kind of prepping for that one mentally and trying to get the tier list in order and try and evaluate where those new buffs and nerfs are going to make everything. But that is going to do it for this week. For now, my name is Boulevard. Thank you so much for watching. I'll be casting the semifinals of the Liga de Runeterra, the Latin America League that me and SGW have been following for the last couple of weeks, tonight and tomorrow. Believe I also have the online league series tomorrow and maybe something else. I'll let you guys know. Follow me on Twitter from the BLVD. That's where you can get all the updates on any last minute casts that I need to confirm, or just find the general humor that I do in Legends of Runeterra. I put out some banger tweets, you're really missing out. As for my loyal followers, content's been a little light, as I think I had mentioned in the last tournament Tactician. I just started a new job. The feng shui hasn't quite settled out yet, but I think that starting next week, maybe the week after, definitely the week after, hopefully next week, I'll be back into a more regular content schedule, because I really hate only putting out one video a week. Like, I want to be making more content, but because of the schedule, I have to make it in advance, which is not something that I had to do before, and honestly, it's just, I'm sort of, just not doing what I need to do to get the content out, and I do apologize for that, because I do still have a lot to say on the current meta and the tournament format and things like that. But there's been a fair amount going on behind the scenes. I'm not here to make excuses, but basically what I'm saying is I'm trying to get out more content for you. Definitely 2 weeks from now, hopefully next week, I will be able to put out at least 3 videos for you, be it patch analysis, analysis of the meta, mostly matchup breakdowns are what I'm looking to do, but honestly, the meta's been evolving so fast, it's been hard to keep up with those, especially finding footage in the way that I do of, each deck winning. These matchups don't happen on camera nearly as often as you would think they do. But yeah, that's kind of all for me this weekend. Thank you so much for staying through the update. As I had mentioned, follow me on Twitter from the BLVD, and you can figure out when and where I'll be casting. So my name is Boulevard, and as always, good luck in your tournaments.